Special edition of Sunday Morning with Robert Wenzel. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. Rather than talk about a specific economic topic, I've decided to bring on one of the top libertarian economists in the country, if not the world, Dr. Walter Block. And I'm down in the corner over here, and in the main screen is Dr. Block. And what we're going to talk about today is some of the terrible things that are being said about him. That he's pro-slavery, that he's a racist. It doesn't stop. So I don't know how much I can help Walter out here, but we'll see what we can do. Now, before I ask Walter any questions, I just want to tell you, Dr. Block is not a slouch here. His CV is 141 pages long. He's a graduate of James Madison High School in Brooklyn. Now, the only reason that's really noteworthy is that he went to school with Bernie Sanders. So he was in the same class. They were on a running team together. And then he went on to Brooklyn College, which I believe Bernie also did. And then Walter received his PhD in economics from Columbia University. And his PhD, one of his PhD advisors was Gary Becker, who was a Nobel Prize winner, and also later went on to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So we're not talking a slouch here. Now, in addition, Dr. Block has written over 500 refereed journal articles. So those aren't articles that are just put up somewhere. I mean, there's people in the sectors where he's writing who are looking at what he's writing and commenting. And here's just an example of some of the journals he's written for. He's written for the Journal of Libertarian Studies, the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics, the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy, the American Review of Political Economy, the International Journal of Social Economics, the Human Rights Review, the American Journal of Economics and Sociology, the NYU Journal of Law and Liberty, the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, the European Journal of Law and Economics, the American Journal of Criminal Law, the William and Mary Environmental Law and Public Policy Review, the Brigham Young University Journal of Public Law, the Asian Economic Review, and the Fordham University Law and Environmental Journal. That's just to name a few. Walter has also written over 20 books, and I'm not going to mention them all here. I'm only going to mention one. It's, I believe, his first book was written published in 1976, called "Defending the Undefendable," and I credit that book, or I blame that book. It depends upon how you want to look at it, with causing me, along with books by Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard and Harry Brown, I credit those books with making me more radical than the founding fathers. Now, what I find most interesting in the book, there's two things that need to be noted about it. One, Dr. Block sort of expands what libertarianism about and applies it in sectors you wouldn't already think of, and defends people that are normally you wouldn't think of as defendable, including loan sharks, pimps, so on and so forth. And he applies libertarian principle. And here's what's interesting. Friedrich Hayek, who at the time was 77 years old, wrote this about the book. Now, Friedrich Hayek is a Nobel Prize winner, and he wrote this: "Looking through Defending the Undefendable made me feel that I was once more exposed to the shock therapy by which more than 50 years ago the late Ludwig von Mises converted me to a consistent free market position." Now, Hayek, Nobel Prize winner, out of Austria, taught at the University of Chicago, taught at the London School of Economics, and this is what he's saying. Some may find it too strong a medicine, but it will still do them good even if they hate it. A real understanding of economics demands that one disabuses oneself of many dear prejudices and illusions. Popular fallacies in economics frequently express themselves in unfounded prejudices against other occupations. In showing the falsity of these stereotypes, you are doing a real service, although you will not make yourself more popular with the majority. So that, for an economist at the age of 77, a Nobel Prize winner, to say he's been shocked, it's a shock therapy, that is just utterly remarkable. Great, great, great stuff. So anyways, at this point, Walter, I bring you in. We know you push the edges. We know you're like a scientist with a microscope looking at the rock and trying to see exactly what it's made out of. And as Hayek warns, this is going to get you in trouble sometimes. And now you've got people calling you pro-slavery, a racist. What is going on?
Wow. Well, Bob, thanks for that introduction. I don't know that I've ever had a better, longer one. I'm very indebted to you for it. What happened was the New York Times interviewed me, maybe 2 interviews, each of about an hour and a half for a total of about 3 hours. And the reason they interviewed me is they were doing, I later learned, a hatchet job on Rand Paul when he was running for president. So this would have been 2014, 2015 for the 2016 election. And they were trying to ask me, what is libertarianism? And I was giving them the usual stuff, the non-aggression principle, private property rights based on homesteading, Robert Nozick's legitimate title transfer, like if I trade you this wristwatch for your shirt, even though I never produced that shirt that you did, I own it because you agreed.
Walter, I just want to stop you here for one minute, Walter, because you brought up the name Robert Nozick, and you're explaining things to the New York Times in terms of Robert Nozick. Now, Robert Nozick was a very well-respected Harvard philosophy professor. So you're not, bringing stuff out of, the deep dark depths when you're bringing your theories in. I mean, they have solid basis here. So go on.
Well, not only Robert Nozick, but I was giving him John Locke and Murray Rothbard on homesteading theory and the non-aggression principle. And, there's just the usual boilerplate mainstream libertarian view. And they just weren't getting it. And I wasn't sure whether they weren't getting it because they were too stupid or because they were malevolent and just didn't want to get it. So finally, after, 2 hours of going around and round about free association and private property rights and all this, I sort of reached for the atom bomb or the H-bomb. And I said, look, why was slavery an abomination? Why was slavery an evil? Why was it just a horrific anti-libertarian enterprise or institution? And I said, well, was it because they had to pick cotton? No, a lot of people pick cotton. Picking cotton isn't per se evil. Is it because they lived in a shack? No. Was it because they ate gruel? No. I didn't even give them this one, but I could have. I said, is it because they got whipped? And again, I said no, because sadists whip masochists. We just had a boxing match and they were whipping each other. The key why slavery was an abomination, why it was a horror, why it was a violation of rights, why it's incompatible with libertarianism is because they were compelled to do that. And then I said if they did the very same things and they weren't compelled to do it, well then that sort of slavery wouldn't be so bad. Namely, if, that you'd have to be a little weird to agree to do these things, but if you did, it wouldn't be so bad because you agreed to it. So to me, the essence of libertarianism is, did you agree to do something? Is it a voluntary interaction or is it coerced? That's the main essence of libertarianism. So what these rascals did is they quoted me as saying that Bloch thinks that actual slavery wasn't so bad. And, that's a perversion of what I said. I think actual slavery was horrible. It's probably the second most horrible thing to mass murder that human beings have ever done to human beings. And there was this guy, Frederick Douglass, who was a black abolitionist, wrote in the 1840s, 1850s. And he was a house slave. And I later learned from Tom Woods about this, but he was saying roughly the same thing I was saying. He was a house slave, and what he said is, look, they treat me nicely. They treat me much better than the field slaves. But that's not the point. The point is that they compel me to be a slave, and that's the horror of slavery. And I was just sort of, channeling him, even though I didn't know he said that. As I said later on, Tom Woods brought that quote to my attention. And, I have a long paper trail of about maybe 6 or 8 articles out of those 500 plus where I call for the reparations to the grandchildren of slaves for slavery, namely what should have occurred in 1865 when slavery ended, is that the plantations should have gone to the slaves, not to the white owners. And had they gone to the slaves in 1865, presumably they would have given it to their children, and now some black guy in Harlem or Bedford-Stuyvesant would have been the owner of, or the part owner of some plantation in South Carolina or Louisiana or wherever. So it's hardly, I'm hardly a pro-slavery person if I say that we should even have reparations for slavery. That shows that I think slavery was a crime, and you have to have reparations for criminal behavior.
Right. Yeah. Walter, I have the exact quote, and this is actually remarkable because you said they spoke to you for 3 hours, the New York Times people. And this is all they wrote about you in the article. Walter Block, an economics professor at Loyola University in New Orleans, who described slavery as, quote, not so bad, unquote, is also highly critical of the Civil Rights Act. Woolworth has lunchroom counters, and no blacks were allowed, he said in a telephone interview. Did they have a right to do that? Yes, they did. No one is compelled to associate with people against their will. So, according to this, it sounds to, I mean, they're completely taking you out of context when they say, you said slavery is not as bad. And your argument, I actually found, your interview was in January 2014, or that's when it appeared in New York Times. But in February of the year before, you pretty much made the same article. Argument. I don't know if you're familiar with this article, but you said free association is a very important aspect of liberty. It is crucial. Indeed, it is lack. Its lack was the major problem with slavery. The slaves could not quit. They were forced to, and you have in quotes, associate with their masters when they would have vastly preferred not to do so. Otherwise, slavery wasn't so bad. You could pick cotton, sing songs, be fed nice gruel. The only real problem was that the relationship was compulsory. So, for them to get this quote when you have a track record, I mean, it's clear they took it completely out of context there.
Yes, what happened was I went to the lower court and sued them, and the lower court threw out my case on the grounds that the New York Times used my exact words, namely, slavery wouldn't be so bad. They forgot about the part of if it was non-compulsory. What happened, one of the upper courts said, what the New York Times did to me would have been akin to what a journalist would have done to Churchill if they had quoted Churchill accurately, his exact words, democracy is the worst system of them all, period. Whereas what Churchill said was, democracy is the worst system of them all except for all the others. Well, if you leave out except for all the others, then you use his exact words, but you make him appear to be saying the exact opposite of what he's saying. Well, that's what the upper court said that the New York Times did to me. Namely, they quoted me accurately saying slavery wouldn't be so bad, but then they forgot about the other part, if it was voluntary, which it never was. It was always compulsory. So we're now back in the lower court. And we'll have to see what the lower court says. But the New York Times lost its battle with us in the upper court, and the judge awarded my lawyers fees, legal fees against the New York Times. And these lawyers, they make a lot of money. They make like $400 or $500 an hour. So initially, when I first lost, the lower court judge awarded, said they were dismissing my case with prejudice, which means I have to pay the legal fees of the New York Times, which my lawyers announced there would be about 100,000, which, that's serious money. And people started sending me money. I didn't even go on, any of these web things, and I thanked them. But I said, hey, don't send me any money yet. I haven't lost, or at least we're still appealing. So now, in an act of poetic justice, the court awarded my lawyers legal fees against the New York Times. So they're going to have to pay something like $375 an hour or $400 an hour. I forget the exact amount, but these guys make a lot of money per hour. That's pretty good.
Wow, awesome. Yeah, and I have a quote here from it's the Fifth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, federal court. If, as Block has pleaded, he stated during the interview that slavery was, quote, not so bad, unquote, except for its involuntariness, a reasonable jury could determine that the New York Times decontextualized quotation falsely portrayed him as communicating that chattel slavery itself was not problematic. Exactly the opposite of the point that he says he was making. And of course, you have your paper trail, which shows many situations where you do that. Now, you're also there's an article I saw where you called for Thomas Sowell to win the Nobel Prize, and for those who don't know, Thomas Sowell is a black economist. So if you're some kind of racist, that's a very unusual recommendation for a Nobel Prize.
Yes. In addition. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. You're also open borders, which not a lot of libertarians are. So, you have no problem with people coming here from Somalia, right? Is that part of your?
Well, it's a complicated thing. I'm not exactly open borders, but I am open borders. But what I say is that what we ought to do is privatize every square inch of the country, and then if people come in without permission, then they're trespassing. But right now, given that we have empty areas, like in the middle of Nevada or Wyoming or Alaska, there's nobody there. And suppose somebody comes from Nairobi or Mars for all of that, and they start homesteading. Did they commit a crime? I say no, they didn't commit any crime. They're just homesteading, a la John Locke or Murray Rothbard, and anyone who stops them is himself a criminal, namely the government. So if you are afraid of rape-fugees, and there are rape-fugees, let's privatize everything, and then people can only come in by invitation. So it's a little complicated, but I am open borders, with the caveat that if people don't like being inundated by hordes of people, let them privatize things. But another point I was going to make is that I have, maybe a dozen or a dozen and a half black co-authors. And as you, Thomas Sowell is not one of them, but he is contributed a chapter to a book that I edited. Perhaps the most famous of my black co-authors is Walter Williams, another very famous black economist, and I have maybe a dozen others. So if I'm really a racist, what am I doing with black co-authors? A co-authorship, for those of you, those in your listening audience that don't realize it, is sort of like almost a marriage, a temporary marriage, but a marriage. You work together, you send the article back and forth, you discuss it, you might argue with it, argue with each other, like husbands and wives do, and then finally you come up with an article, and I've done this maybe a dozen times, and if I were a racist and hated black people, what am I doing co-authoring articles with black people? What am I doing calling for reparations? What am I doing talking about the Frederick Douglass positively? So I think that this argument that I'm a racist or hate black people or whatever it is just as silly as thinking that I favor slavery.
Yeah. Now, you have no problem debating this with anyone. I know both of us like to debate, so I know you would be happy to debate this with anyone anytime. Your position, I would guess.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
I want to clarify one thing with regard to the diner situation, where you said you would be, in libertarian terms, if a diner is privately owned, which they all are, diners, the owners can then determine who can't. Now, you come from a Jewish background, so you wouldn't have any problem from a libertarian perspective with the diner owner who wanted to prevent you from eating at his diner because you're of Jewish background. Is that correct?
Well, I wouldn't say I wouldn't have any problem with, but I'm glad you said I wouldn't have any problem as a libertarian.
Right.
Because that's a crucial issue. I mean, I would have a problem with it. I wouldn't like to be boycotted, or people saying I can't come into their restaurant. I mean, I'll behave. My table manners might not be perfect, but I'm a reasonable diner. But the question is, should they go to jail if they say that? And this goes against free association. I mean, the big problem with slavery was that it violated free association. Namely, the slave didn't want to associate with the master, and the master forced them to. The big problem with rape is that the rape victim doesn't want to associate, doesn't want to have anything to do with the rapist, and the rapist compels her to have something to do with him. Namely, he forces her to have sexual intercourse. You could say that there are really three foundations of libertarianism. One is the non-aggression principle. The other is private property rights based on homesteading and no-Zickian title transfer. And the third one is free association. We libertarians favor free association. And free association means that you don't compelled to associate with anyone against your will. And if there were an anti-Semitic restaurant owner who didn't want Jews, or an anti-black restaurant owner who didn't want black people, or a black restaurant owner who didn't want any whites in his restaurant, they should be free to do this. Now, there are two people that have done more than anyone else. You see, this sounds callous, because it's not so much when Jews are not allowed to go into a restaurant, but when blacks are not allowed to go into a restaurant, it sounds very callous. It sounds very harsh. There are two economists, both of whom I think should get the Nobel Prize in economics, Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell, who have done more than any other two economists on the planet to show that these sorts of boycotts or these sorts of refusals to deal with the downtrodden group, like, say, the black minority, are impotent. They really can't hurt blacks. Let's take the case of the back of the bus. In Jim Crow era in the 1920s, 1930s, blacks were not allowed to ride in the front of the bus. And there was this woman who was sitting in the front of the bus in a seat, and a white man came along and said, sorry, lady, you'll have to move to the back. And she refused, and she was arrested. And the question is, why didn't some other bus company set up shop? Why didn't some other bus company come in and say, hey, black people, you can ride in the front, you can ride in the back, you can ride in the middle, we don't care, just you're welcome, come on in. And they would have got all the black customers and maybe half the white customers, because if there's a white person standing at a bus stop and the bus that allows blacks to ride anywhere comes by, rather than wait 20 minutes for a white-only bus or a white in the front of the bus, they might take it. Well, why didn't some other bus company come in? And the answer is because in order to set up a bus company, you have to get a franchise or a permit, and you have to get a permit from the same people who started the Jim Crow in the first place. So the point that Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams would make, and I'm their student in this regard, is that under free enterprise, if you have a restaurant that says no blacks allowed, some other restaurant is going to open up right next door and they're going to say, black people, you're allowed, come on in. And they would get all the black customers and maybe some of the white customers. And in other words, this would be impotent to hurt black people. Or let's say, take one more example. Suppose we have this prejudice and we're not going to hire black people. And if we refuse to hire them, that means that their wages will go down. But if their wages go down, then they're more attracted to be hired. So somebody's going to hire them. So again, I'm channeling Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell, and I'm saying this sounds cruel, but it really doesn't work. It doesn't have any effect. So you don't really need a law to protect the despised minority. You can just allow free enterprise to work, and free enterprise will protect the minority groups. And we can have our cake and eat it. We can have free association. No one is compelled to serve people that they don't want to, and also it's not going to harm the target of the discrimination. Like, take these cases where now the gay people want to have a gay wedding, and they want to compel a baker and a photographer and a florist to go and help out with their gay wedding. And the baker and the florist and the photographer are Christians, fundamentalist Christians, and they don't want to have anything to do with a gay wedding because they think it's against their principles, their religious principles. And yet the courts compel them. I think that the courts fine the baker like $150,000 because he wouldn't bake a wedding cake for a gay couple. Well, this is a rights violation. Nobody should be forced to associate with anyone against their will, whether it's a slave or a rape victim or a florist or a photographer or a baker or anyone. The free society, the ideal society, is that the only interaction is voluntary. Voluntariness is the very core of libertarianism, which was the point I was trying to make to the New York Times, and I failed. I tried my best, but I didn't make it.
Okay. Now, just because this is in the news right now, what thoughts do you have on this sort of NFL kneeling thing in President Trump? If you want to talk about that, see if
Sure.
it get you in more trouble.
Yes, I'm always happy to get in trouble by upholding the truth and the American way, or whatever you want to call it. First of all, what the government does is it has these flyovers where the planes go over the football game, and what's that? The stadium. Why are we? I mean, I'm an anarchist, so I'm against all government, period. But even if I were a minarchist, the function of the government is to protect people, and those planes are supposed to protect people, not to fly over stadiums when there's a football thing. So that's a subsidy. Another subsidy is, the football stadium is heavily subsidized. They shouldn't have that. Another point is, I do masters competitive swimming and race walking, and before every event, they have the Star Spangled Banner. Why do they do that? I feel like going down on one knee, not because I'm a Black Lives Matter person, but because I'm against the government, and the government is sort of cramming down this Star Spangled Banner down my throat. Problem is, I can't go down on one knee. I'd never get up. I'm too old and fat to get up. But if I could, I would go down on one knee. What I'll do is I'll sit while they have it, and I don't try to interfere. But
Walter? So have you gone to, say, a baseball game or basketball, and you sit during the national anthem?
Absolutely, and sometimes I get beer poured down my back because you got these patriotic people. No, I don't stand for the national anthem. I think the government is the U.S. government is an evil government. It runs roughshod over the world. It's the only government that ever dropped atom bombs on people. It has 1,000 military bases in about 150 countries, and there are only about 200 countries, and they call that defense. So I'm not a big fan of the U.S. government, and I wouldn't go down on one knee because I couldn't get up, but I would sit for it, and I don't like it. So one solution to this problem is just don't have the Star Spangled Banner, and then the football players wouldn't have to go down on one knee, and there wouldn't be any controversy. On the other hand, if it's a private company, and if the football people want to have the Star Spangled Banner, well, they're the employer, and if they want to fire any football player or basketball player, I think the NBA is coming up, and I'll bet you that they'll do similar things, well, then they should fire him, or they should say, okay, we respect it. Or I think the NFL has a contract with all the players that you have to stand solemnly and maybe put your hand over your heart or, salute or whatever. You have to be respectful when they play that. And if they're not, they're violating their contract. So I think the solution is don't play it in the first place, or if you play it, whatever the contract says, whatever the agreement is. And if the NFL allows their players, their employees to disrespect the flag or disrespect the country or disrespect the Star Spangled Banner, well, then people will vote with their feet. Namely, they won't patronize the NFL, and maybe there'll be another football league, the American Football League, or I don't know, the U.S. Football League, and in the U.S. Football League, they're going to make sure that when they're going to play the Star Spangled Banner, and if people don't respect it, well, then they'll fire them, and maybe that new league will beat the present NFL or the present NBA if the NBA goes down that route, which I strongly suspect. So I think that would be a libertarian analysis of this controversial issue.
Okay, great. All right, I don't have any more questions for you. Is there anything else you want to say in your defense, why you're not a racist or anything? I think we covered most of it, but do you have any personal experiences you can tell us about? You saved a baby thrown into a river. You have a little black baby and
no, I never saved a black baby in a river, although I'm a very good swimmer, and if there were a black or a blue or a green baby in the water, I would jump in and try to save them. But, it really depends on what you mean by racist. If by racist you mean somebody who draws crosses on black people's lawns and lights a fire, or God forbid hangs black people like they used to do under the Jim Crow regime, well, that's horrible. I mean, that's just despicable. That's a violation of libertarianism. It's a violation of property rights. It's a violation of personal rights. On the other hand, I note that blacks are only 14% of the population, and they're 70% of the NFL and 85% of the NBA. And I also note, so, blacks are superior in those games. And take a look at the Olympics and the 100-yard or the 200 or the 400-meter race or the marathon. It's virtually all black. On the other hand, you go to the swimming pool, and there are no blacks in there. In the Olympics. And in 20, 30, 50 years ago, it could have been because the blacks weren't allowed in the pool. But they've been allowed in the pool for many years. And I think the reason that they're not good swimmers is because they're not fat enough. They don't float as well as white people. But what I'm now saying could be construed as racism, because I'm now noting that there are differences in the races. There was this book, I forget who it's by, it's White Men Can't Jump. Well, that's true. White men can't jump. Well, they can jump a little, but they can't jump as well as black people. So black people have certain excellences and certain shortfalls, and white people have certain excellences and shortfalls. And to say this, like Charles Murray talked about IQ, and black IQ is lower than white. And by the way, Oriental IQ is higher than white. So whites are in the intermediate position. But he is strongly condemned for being a racist because he notes differences in IQs. Well, if it's racism to note differences, by the way, black people have darker skin than white people. I'm going out on a limb here, and I'm going to be accused of racism, but that's true. And they're less susceptible to sunburn, and they have more sickle cell anemia than white people, and Jews have more Tay-Sachs diseases. And now I'm just mentioning whole differences between whites and blacks and Jews and Orientals. Well, if that's racism, I'm a racist. And New York Times make the best of that. I'm a racist in that sense, namely that I notice there are differences between the races. And on the other hand, if I have ill will toward black people and I want to kill them all or hurt them in some way, or I urge violence against them, well, I don't. I'm a libertarian. I can't. As a libertarian. If I did, I wouldn't be a libertarian. So I'm not a racist in that sense, but I'm a racist in this other sense. So whether I'm a racist or not all depends upon how you define racism. And I think it's silly to define racism as noting that there are differences between the races. That's just preposterous. I mean, there are obvious differences between the races, and I've just hit the tip of the iceberg, 4 or 5 differences. But any rational person, if you ask them, are there differences between the races? Of course there are differences between the races. There are differences between men and women. There are differences between, short people and tall people, between those of us who are follically challenged like me and those of whom are not follically challenged like you. There are differences all over the place, and to just notice differences, well, I think that's the first step of science, is to observe the differences in reality. And if that's racism, I'm a racist. And there's nothing wrong with racism in that sense, but there's plenty wrong with racism in the other sense.
Right. Okay. All right. I think that brings us full circle. You're a scientist now, putting things under the microscope. And I mean, if you got a minute, I want to ask you, what is going on in society where you think it's objectionable to sort of recognize obvious physical differences? What do you think is behind it? Do you have any thoughts on that, or?
Well, I think it's cultural Marxism. The economic Marxism has been an utter failure. I mean, look at what happened in the Soviet Union. Look at what's happened in Venezuela. Look at what's happening in North Korea. Economic Marxism has just gone down the toilet. So there are some people that love to just run the lives of other people. And for a while, they were doing it with environmentalism. You know, if you smoke or, you know, this or that. And they love to control other people, and the vehicle of Marxism, economic Marxism, failed. The vehicle of green, left-wing, watermelon, red on the inside, green on the outside, environmentalism, it's still working for them, but they needed something else, and they come up with cultural Marxism. And cultural Marxism is, you know, white males are at the top, and we have white privilege and male privilege, and we exploit everyone else. And I guess black women are at the bottom of the heap, and they get exploited by everybody, and the gays get exploited. And part of that is trigger warnings and microaggressions and things like that. Well, it's now a microaggression by the politically correct to say anything that they don't like. Well, one thing they don't like is to notice differences between races. What I just said about, you know, there are these differences between the races and certainly between the sexes, the genders, is 180 degrees opposite of political correctness, of cultural Marxism. And I think this is their way of trying to run other people. I mean, there are certain people that just like to run other people's lives. And they have these different vehicles, and the one du jour is cultural Marxism. And I think that explains to some degree this refusal to see things that are as clear as the nose on our faces, namely that there are differences between the races, between men and women, between tall people and short people, between fat people and skinny people. There are differences all over the place, and social science is supposed to be first of all, acknowledging this, and secondly, trying to explain and understand that. And, you know, this is somehow verboten.
Okay, great. Well, I think we just lost your audio, so
Oh,
okay,
wow.
I think you're back now. No,
Okay.
the gods are sending us a signal. You've got yourself in enough trouble already.
Well, Bob, thanks for having me on your show. It's always a delight.
Yeah,
We'll be in touch. Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye.